Welcome back. I'm Joe DiGiulio. We're back here in DiGiulio Studios. We're getting ready to actually do the full-blown painting now. If you saw my earlier episode, I showed you how my canvas is prepped. Now that it's done so, we're ready to apply the paint. Today, in this little quick lesson or video to get you into what I do in my studio, I'm going to kind of let you get into my thought process. And that's what today's all about. It's really the 3 layers of painting that I do when I get started. We've got a mid-tone that we established earlier. It's done with gesso and application of the Australian sienna. It's a structure paint by Matisse. So now I want to start applying layers. And in the layers that I create, I start with a light transparent that gives us kind of a mid-tone. Then the second part of the process is actually using the dark. I do like Prussian blue for that. I use it a lot of times as opposed to black. I don't like black so much for the orange because I don't want pumpkin-y looking, kind of Halloweenish. And the blue is on the opposite end of the color wheel from the orange, so it's very complementary. So I do like to use this quite a bit in my applications. So to start, we're going to do a light transparent color. We got a couple of oranges and reds, vermilion, I think this is. No, this is the cadmium red light. We can apply that down in some areas. It's going to be loose and free and not really a whole lot of thought in that because we're eventually going to develop a focal point, but that has to occur as we evolve. First part, let's take a little bit of, put out a couple of these here and just push the paint around. Now, one thing I want to concern myself with is I want to develop a focal point. So we need to know a very important rule or aspect of painting that I'm sure maybe quite a few of you have heard of if you're a landscape painter. It's called the rule of thirds. What the rule of thirds basically says is dividing your canvas horizontally and vertically into thirds. Let's say you drew imaginary lines across it, okay? Almost like a tic-tac-toe pattern. Okay, with that being in mind, where those lines would intersect, here, 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 or here, that is where I'm at, in an abstract, I'm going to develop a focal point. I'm not going to put it right in the middle because then it stagnates the action I want to create. And as an abstract expressionist, they were sometimes considered as action painters. So that's kind of what we're doing today, using some palette knives. And we have a brand new brush that I'm very excited about. It's the Staccato brand here. And I think my motto is going to be staccato. So taking that is a nice, beautiful, firm brush that I'm going to be able to apply this base of acrylic paint with. When I start, I don't like to stain a brand new brush with the pigment, so I always pre-wet the brush. That way I don't get this nasty stain on there. I'm going to wring it out, and now it's fully absorbed with water instead of pigment. The very first time I use it, it should not stain so badly. And I'm just using a kind of a bright color that I might put in one of those 4 considered areas. And there's not any rhyme or reason to it. I'm just putting out some tone. You'll see why. I'm going to maybe mix in some of the other color. But see, I could take and make a hard edge with the application of color. You see that hard edge here? Your eye is going to focus more on a hard edge than it is on one that is kind of just kind of gradated out like you see here. So that is how I'm going to develop a focal point, is using a hard edge. But right now what we're doing is getting some transparent tones on, creating maybe a little bit of action. Doesn't have to be anything specific, but I'm trying to get the eye of the observer to travel through the piece. And I'm going to do that by putting some lights and some transparent colors down. Okay, now that was quite simple, with just a very basic beginning approach there. I'm going to actually introduce some more of my Australian sienna. It is a very darker, it can be put on as a dark. And see, I can apply it right out of the tube in that fashion. I could pull it around with a palette knife if I wanted to do that. And that just creates some more interesting effects. Kind of the same technique I used when I did the canvas, right? Okay, now so maybe I want to have these really hard shapes here, because that kind of makes my eye get carried through the piece. But maybe when I get away from the area I want to draw focus at, I might take and blend some of that out. Just to create an area of interest. I might want to lighten, I might want to darken. Let's take a little bit of white out and we can mute some of these tones as well. Now see, I have this mid-tone, and then I introduce the white to kind of echo that mid-tone, or shadow it, sort of like, and that starts to kind of get something developed here, you see? I like to soften the edges. I want your eye to be focused in this area as opposed to over here. So I will mute tones with opaque colors. So I've got like a little basic, some lights, transparents, and that is basically the first step. We're not going to spend 4 or 5 hours. You'd be surprised at what you could do in 15, 20 minutes, because we've done all the prep already, that hour or so of prep with the mid-tone paint that is going to fill in the spots where we don't have other color at. And maybe I'm just going to kind of soften that. It doesn't really matter. It's all going to change anyway. Okay, so with that in mind, let's see, I am looking for another item. Here we go. I like to actually carve into wet paint. Now that's an old technique, it's called sgraffito. It's taking the wet paint and actually etching into it. I like to use, this is a Jerry's Jet Black pencil. It's kind of like a Conte, almost like an oil base, but in a pencil form. And I can use it on a dry canvas to make a positive mark. But I can also etch into paint and reveal color that's underneath it to create a more sgraffito effect. So it's kind of a positive and negative effect with the Jerry's Jet Black pencil. I like this quite a bit. I usually try to put it in a lot of my kits for my students as well. But it's just going to give us some linear action. We do line, shape, color, and texture. That's the 4 elements I teach. And we're going to incorporate them into 3 layers. The transparent, which we've got down, and that's going to move now into creating the contrast with a darker, and I'm using a Prussian blue in this case. These Lucas Studio paint line is a great intermediate price point paint line. I like it because if I'm doing large areas of canvas, I don't want, $25, 7 ounce, little tiny 2-ounce tubes that are $25 to cover a 6 by 4 foot canvas. I'm thinking of the economics of it all the time. So I can use a studio grade. I like to say there's a student grade, a studio grade, and a fine artist grade. I like to use this Lucas for doing some of these areas and creating some bold contrast to it. You see how that really kind of pops out and creates some interesting effects. Do I have a plan on what I'm doing? No, I'm not really thinking about it at all. I'm just coming in here and painting some areas in. They might change as I go along. But I'm constantly thinking about how I can guide the observer's eye through the piece. And I'm going to do that by creating these linear marks on the canvas. And sometimes when the paint is wet and it mixes with the other, like in this case, the sienna, the Australian sienna mixing with the dark Prussian blue, it can create a third tertiary color. But with a thicker application of the blue, which I'm using right now, I can cover that up. So the kind of cool thing is the dark, the second phase of the painting process for me, is also sort of works like an opaque. I can cover up and create new shapes from it. So with that being said, let's take, and I want to dilute this paint now a little bit, because another little trick I like to do is called a splatter. And I want to get that paint flicked out in a way to create some exciting imagery, and I want it to flow with whatever else is already going on here. So I'm dropping some of that tone in. Let's do that. Let's give that a little bit of a break there. Push more color on there. Accentuate. I'm not only using the brush this way, but I'm going to use the brush in this way to get some different kind of linear elements going on. I always like to go, and once I paint, I'll stop and I go, okay, what's the lightest thing? I make that lighter. What's the darkest thing? I want to make that darker. That broadens the range of color from lights to dark that way, and will help with just creating more dynamic effect. Gives you a little more drama. Okay, let's see. Let's carry this on down, just because I think that would be interesting to this piece. And see, the cool thing is if I don't like it, then I can edit that once this dries. Right now, the transparents, the first phase, and the darks, the second phase, are the parts I will do, and then I will let it dry. Once it's dry, then I'll come back with opaque colors, and I will remove the areas that I don't like. So right now, I'm painting the S's. I let it dry, and then I'll paint the nose. And I mean N-O, not nose, but the parts I don't like. And you see, now I'm kind of getting some interesting effect, and I'm seeing some kind of action going on here. And right now I'm looking at it as if this is the top. And I am constantly, when I'm painting, turning that canvas. See what other ideas might pop out or might develop along the way. I don't have a firm idea of what I want to create at the beginning, but I want to know I want to stick to those three principles of transparents, darks, and then the opaques. That I know I can work my way out of almost any kind of situation that I feel like the painting is not resolved. So I have some interesting splatters. I got some cool textures we developed earlier. I will let that sit for a little bit. I might introduce a little bit of another color here. This is sort of like a beautiful jewel tone, the turquoise, or some lines of color will call it a teal. I've heard it called a cobalt teal, a cobalt turquoise. But this is just simply a DiGiulio Studios turquoise paint, and I use that a lot, as you can see in my work. So with that being said, let me take a little smaller brush, and let's see if I can keep the paint tube out of the palette. Matter of fact, I'm going to move all this over here. I'll be using more of the white. Now see what I just did wrong there. I did not put this in the water first. Virgin brush. First time I get a brush out and use it, I wanted to get it nice and wet before I apply it into color. And I might just kind of, you see, that might create some interesting, I want the action to come from here out, so I might take the brush and squish it that way, pull it, just to create some beautiful eye candy, for lack of a better word. Okay, so now we're just using a nice brilliant color, and I want to add some little additional eye candy to the piece. So I'm just dropping in little flicks of color here and there and everywhere. I'm not really so much worried about, is it, like see here, I can let some of that tone through rather than having the raw white canvas. This is the plus part right here of having that toned canvas come through. Okay, so we have like 4 or 5 basic tones. Now let's start changing the value of these tones by introducing some white to each of the colors. And we'll use that to soften these edges to give the eye a resting spot where the tone of the color won't be so bold. We're always trying to make the focus right in the bright area, and then as we move away from the area, we're softening the color. And we're going to do that now with white. And that is the third level, using white to mute the tones. White is an opaque color. That means when it's applied, you can't see through it. So I can create new shapes and new edges with the application of white along with another color mixed together with it. For example, I can take the blue here, right? And pick up some white and make this softer, more muted tone of blue. And it might give us just a little more interest in the piece here. And it is opaque, so if I wanted to kind of cover over that shape there, and now I've got a nice great line, you see where it covered right over the dark. The opaques will cover the darks as well as the lights. Set that off to the side. Going to maybe mess around with the pencil a little bit more, so you can see that sgraffito effect again. I'm etching into the color. This is something I typically do with all of my work, is I like to create some kind of excitement and action, some energy with the application of the pencil. So it scratches in, it makes a negative mark or a positive mark. Okay? Let's see what we got here. Let's take a little bit of this. I don't know what this is going to look like. Is it going to be kind of a drabby brown? Could be, but let's add this to it, and that makes kind of a funky gray color that I'm not feeling. So we'll just add a little bit of that to it, soften that tone up, and that can be introduced as another tone in there. It's just a lighter version of what's there already. I need to get more of that white in there. I'm liking that. Maybe pick up some of this blue. What I'm doing now is I'm just taking the color and mixing everything on the palette, and that's giving me this third color that's going to be in harmony with everything we're doing, simply because it's a tone that's made up of the other colors that are already on the palette. So it will work. Now see, I'm going to flick this one out. Ooh, that was heavy-handed. I wasn't expecting that. This is what we would call a pleasant surprise. I do like how it was applied. However, that was not meant to be. I meant to reduce the viscosity of the paint so it will fly off the brush a little bit easier. This is a controlled splatter. This is kind of another one of the elements I do when I paint. And I know when I flick it out, it's going to arc. If I'm in this hand, it's going to arc this way. If I'm using this hand, it's going to arc that way. I have an arc going this way, so I'm going to use this brush to fire it out there. And it's just a controlled splatter, and you can see you have this interesting effect that's laid down. Now, it wouldn't be that way if we used the thick out of the tube. So I reduced the viscosity by adding some water in the paint, so it gets more like a cream texture, and that cream texture allows it to fly off of the brush and then make that really interesting effect with the splatter. And when I splatter, I want to take a light color, splatter it on a dark area to create contrast, as opposed to throwing it right over its own color already there. You don't really get to see that as well. So I've got the blue here, and I'm going to just make a fantastic little splatter right there. Now that does not happen in a day. You've got to work on that. In other words, you're not going to come into class at 9 and be able to flick this out at 9:15. You've got to kind of put the work into it, all right? You've got to just learn the viscosities of the paint. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and soften. I'm going to take some of this color here, this yellow, and just pick up this kind of whitish kind of blue mix and mix all of this together. And I want to get a more of a kind of a green muted tone here, you see? And I'm going to use that on one of these edges here, just to create another color and soften that area. And it worked because it is made up of the colors that are already there. You see that? Let me turn this around where I can get to the edge. Sorry, it's probably not in the best camera view, but I have to be able to see it. But let me turn that, and you can see in just the way I'm actually applying that color on there. Same will be going with this edge. You don't want to put it off your edges, especially when you've got these colors that are being made up on your palette from 3 or 4 different colors that you mix together on your palette, because if you do that, it's going to be very difficult to remake that tone to fill your edges. So paint your edges along the way, okay? So we got a little bit of that green tone there. Maybe we'll introduce a little bit of it up here. And you notice how I'm turning the canvas around all the time. I don't paint from one place because I like to change it up a little bit. So we've got that cool green tone there. I like that. Because that green tone is going to be asking to have some of that red splattered on it, because again, they're on opposite ends of the color wheel and they're going to be very complementary to one another. So we'll do that later on. That is kind of like putting the jewelry on things, and it's more of a final part. Let me add a little bit more white to it. I might bleed these together and get a third color now. It's going to be in the same family, but it's going to be a little bit different. All right, because I wanted to actually pull that up here. This is another shape I wanted to create up here. Because I'm trying to get things, the lines, they're all kind of pointing to this area here. The energy is coming from here out. This is coming to it. That is bringing that way. This is typically my style of painting. And I'm using opaques now, the third layer. And what that's going to do, ooh, I got a little contamination there. And I just work that contamination right on over. I blend it out. So, yeah, I meant to do that. That's right. Now let me get some of this paint off my hand. Now I'm like at that point now. I've got some lights, I've got the darks, I've got transparents, I have opaques. I've got some of each layer on there. I could fill out more, but you see on this piece, you see I left a lot of that tinted canvas, the tone part coming through. I will do some more. I could do something to this area, which would be a lightened tone of this, to just kind of give a little bit different effect so it's not all that same orange color. All right. So in doing so, let's take out a little bit of the Australian sienna, and we're going to introduce some white to it to make a muted tone of that. That along with some white. And you see that right there kind of lightens that up just to be another shape. And because it is opaque, you see how I can create a hard edge there. And just like I did in the beginning when I was toning the canvas, I'm just going to blend that tone out. And again, considering my edges. Now with a little work, a little practice, this is something I feel like just about anybody can really do and accomplish. Let's just vary that tone. I'll pick up a little bit of this red contamination in here, add it to that, and that will give me another tone that will be different from everything else. And you see, it's almost identical to the tone that was already there, except because now that it's opaque, you don't see that undulation of tone anymore. I soften that right there, and that makes a place that the eye doesn't focus on, because we don't want to focus on the edges, we want to focus on the middle. Or in the intersection of the rule of thirds that we spoke about earlier. So getting that up there. And it's a little bit varied from this, right? let's say, oh, I didn't like that part. I could just take and cover that up. You see, just like that. Just making some more interesting and something different. It's opaque here, and I'm just kind of letting it blend off into the transparent part right here. But see how I have that white there? That white is what your eye goes right to that white. So I'm going to try to do a little bit more with that. There we go. See, here when I get down to the ending parts of the paintings, I might be a little bit more precise with the application of color. But it's generally just working it over in a very free-form state. Okay. I think I'm going to get a little more of this color. I'm going to pick it up somewhere here. Just a little dab of it to bring the eye over with it. Do you have that green? So let's pick up this. And then once I have that done, I will have established the transparent, the dark, and the opaques. So the final thing that I would do would be actually creating some little bit of bling, some little bit of excitement, some little bit of linear energy. And I like to use what I call those flow expression bottles. I fill them with the exact same paint, the Lucas, because it's a medium viscosity paint, so it flows out without clogging the tube, and we'll get an exciting finish to this piece, okay? So let me just take this here, and how did I make that green before? Well, I might just want to put a little bit of that here, just to kind of bring that together. A little dab of this. Yeah, maybe as a dab of that. Is that what we did? I think so. And now I'm just picking up all the color that's left over. Here we go. And you see when I blend it together on the brush, man, these brushes are fantastic because they have wonderful spring. They can really hold that heavy body acrylic, you know, way better than something that might be a nylon brush. Right up there in quality, if every bit with any golden Taklon brush. Really do like these. Very impressed with this brush. I'm just picking some little spots that might excite the eye with color. All right? I got to blend that out because I don't like that contamination. And very simply, we're on the wind down on this thing. It's amazing what you can do in just a few minutes. Okay, now with that being said, I can go in and enhance these edges with a little bit of pencil work, scratching into it. And so we've got a great situation here, a wonderful piece. Well, I think it's wonderful. I hope you do too. Finally, we've got that. Let's take out a little bit of the, this is again a cadmium red light Lucas Studio paint in a flow expression bottle. And what I'm going to do is, like we see, we made the lines with the jet black pencil. I want to kind of also create a little additional excitement by applying some of this and the linear element. So I'm going to take and I'm going to kind of draw on it, but the critical part of applying paint with the flow expression bottle is you must touch the surface. Don't hover over the surface. All the time my students in my classes, they have their first experience with this and they're hovering over and they're trying to just, and they get this wonky line. I want them to touch and to create a fearless approach. Action. Bring some action to the piece. That is what this is going to do for them. And I like taking little areas like this, creating some visual texture as a finishing touch. And then the piece de resistance, if anybody knows my work, I like to apply the 3 dots. The 3 dots on my pieces represent my wife, myself, and my son. So I can take this and I'm going to drop them right here. Now, fluid acrylic is better for that than these. It's a little softer in body. But when I use the Lucas, because it's more of a heavier body, it's actually a medium body, once I apply it, I want those kind of nipply kind of effects, so I let gravity do the work for me. And they kind of flatten out to a perfect semicircle, all right? So with that being said, that completes the process of this piece. We've taken the mid-tone and the texture we did in the very beginning. We've applied a transparent color. Then we used some contrast. We created contrast with the darks. And then we erased some of the edges and softened the edges and made eye resting spots. So our focus is on the 3 dots and not off to the side. We've done that with the muted opaque. So transparents, darks, opaques. That's my process. I'm Joe DiGiulio. This is DiGiulio Studios. Come on back, and hey, if you like what you saw today, subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you next time.